Atop the mountain, Urk Ironskull was preparing his troops for the assault. But when the Overtyrant's army began to surge up the slopes, it was unlike anything the Greenskins had encountered before. The ground shook with their charge, the force so great that the less sturdy catapults and war machines shook apart, collapsing onto their unfortunate crews. Orcs and goblins alike struggled to keep their footing as the intense shaking caused rocks to tumble down the slopes. The sight of the herd of beasts stampeding toward them was too much for many goblins, as they panicked and began a vain attempt to flee. In contrast, the night goblins, high on their mushrooms, seemed oblivious to the dangers of the wall of muscle and fur that was quickly bearing down on them. They stood their ground, their strange chattering and shrieking becoming harder to hear over the thunderous charge of the ogres. When the ogre front line had closed to within 30 meters, the night goblins released their fanatics, each swinging a giant spiked ball on a long metal chain. These goblins are devastating against most enemies, and would normally tear through their ranks, leaving nothing but a bloody mess. The huge beasts of the ogres, however, were not remotely fazed by the whirling goblins of doom, and they did not even slow their charge. The goblins were quickly trampled underfoot, or kicked aside by the muscular legs of the surging beasts, and within moments of the impact of the two lines, they were all but routed. The charging cavalry crashed into the Black Orcs, a devastating charge that would have broken most foes, but by some miracle, the Black Orc lines held, even as they lost nearly a third of their number upon impact. The Black Orcs surged forward now, their great axes swinging deep into the flesh of the Mournfangs and their riders. A common tactic was to hack the legs of the great beasts, which would cause them to tumble backward into the ogre lines, crushing several ogre warriors that were now surging into the fray. The Black Orcs were causing heavy casualties on the cavalry, now that their charge was halted, but they were pinned in place, and Urk's plan of a devastating Black Orc charge had all but evaporated. Further down the slopes of the great volcano, the jaws of the Greenskins' trap were closing. The ogres were quickly finding themselves outflanked and outnumbered. Had the Black Orcs been able to perform their charge as intended, the ogres may well have been overwhelmed, but without that assault, the ogres were holding their own. As the carnage continued, the Firemouth spoke. Thick plumes of smoke and hot ash were ejected from the volcano's mouth, almost as if it approved of the bloodletting taking place on its slopes. The midday light was soon obscured by the falling ash, the entire battlefield now lit by the rivers of lava that were slowly snaking their way down the slope. At the sight of their deity awakening, the ogre firebellies, the priests of the Firemouth, renewed their assault as they spewed flames into the orc ranks. The stubbornness and tenacity of the ogres was now turning the tide of the lower slopes. Was the momentum of the battle once more shifting to the ogres' favour? Atop the mountain, Urk was reveling in the challenge that the ogres provided. Their bulky frames made them incredibly strong, but his superior martial prowess and speed allowed him to cut a path of destruction through them. He was soaked in blood, its metallic tang mixing with the ash into a sickly paste in his mouth. Around him, his elite corps of Black Orcs was slaughtering the few remaining cavalry and beasts. Their attention could now be turned to the battle further down the slopes. There were no goblins to be seen, except for the bodies of those that had been trampled in the initial charge. All that remained were the jaws of his trap, and their numbers were quickly dwindling. Urk rallied his troops for one final charge, and they swept down the mountain like a great green avalanche. They smashed into the ogre lines, their great weapons cutting deep into the enemy ranks. The ogres gave ground, the overtowering Croesus barking orders, as they formed into a rock-solid formation, with the Overtyrant at its heart, his bodyguard of iron guts surrounding him as the Black Orcs surged around them. For an hour, the elite warriors from each side fought relentlessly, waxing and waning in a macabre dance of death. The veterans on each side pounded at each other, double-handed clubs crushing Black Orc warriors, too exhausted to dodge the blows, while the great choppers of the greenskins sliced deep into the muscle and flesh of the ogres. Urk knew that the longer the battle lasted, the more it would favour his enemy, as his troops were falling in greater numbers as the fray continued. To break the ogres, he would have to break their heart. He would need to kill the over-tyrant. Grisus Goldtooth saw the orc warlord cutting a path to him, a smile forming across his face, as he now saw an opportunity to break the back of the orc force. He too surged forward, pushing past his bodyguard, ignoring their grumbles. Grisus swung his massive scepter, clearing himself some room to attack the Black Orc warlord. His blows knocked back ranks of orcs, one strike felling Urk's personal banner-bearer, snapping the standard and knocking the orc high into the air. It's a blow that surviving ogres still talk of to this day, marvelling at the distance and height that was achieved. Urk, enraged by the death of his standard-bearer, sliced through a half-dozen iron guts, the blades of his axes dripping with their blood. He and Grisus now stood before one another. For a long moment, the two generals sized up their opponent's worth, and all the time the battle continued to rage around them. Grisus bared his teeth, several of which were replaced by gold and glinted in the firelight. He laid down his scepter and lunged at the Black Orc warboss. Urk quickly brought his twin axes up, biting into the exposed chest of the over-tyrant. Then, pulling back a step, he swung his axes downward, intending to cut into the over-tyrant's legs, hoping to use his own weight against him. Grisus was unfazed by his wounds, and he snatched up his opponent with his meaty hands. Urk tried to break free, but his arms were now pinned to his sides, and he was losing his grip on his axes. Any movement only seemed to increase the pressure that Grisus exerted, as he squeezed and squeezed till his biceps bulged and ached from the effort. Time seemed to slow, seconds drawing into minutes. Then Urk's armor buckled, and a moment later, a sickly wet crack signaled the end of the Black Orc warlord. His spine snapped in several places. A minute later, the over-tyrant finally released his grip, and Urk, an almost unrecognizable pulp, dropped to the ground. A great cheer erupted from the ogres that had witnessed the death of their enemy's leader, and word quickly spread through the ranks of both armies of the fate of Urk Ironskull. Without their leader, the fight was taken out of the bulk of the orc force. Only a few valiant pockets of black orcs, too caught up in the bloodlust of battle, fought on, even though their fate was sealed. As the last of the greenskins fled the battlefield, or fell to the surging ogre forces, Grisus surveyed the scene around him. The volcano's slopes were littered with bodies, goblins, orcs and ogres, all having paid the ultimate price for their leader's cause. As the night drew in and a chill settled over the slopes of the Firemouth, the ogres gathered up the slaughtered greenskins for a great feast. Each ogre had their fill of greenskin flesh to devour as they celebrated their victory and sang songs late into the night. In one great battle, Grisus Goldtooth had broken the greenskin war, crushed the life from its leader, and cemented his position as over-tyrant over all the Ogre Kingdoms. Even the most pig-headed of tyrants would now be forced to acknowledge his right to rule. Today the orcs, tomorrow the world. Let them all tremble. Warhammer 3 will open up the region of the Mountains of Morn, and the pre-order may well bring us the Ogre Kingdoms, so recreating this epic battle could be a possibility when the game releases. While I expect the Firemouth volcano to be represented on the campaign map, will we see a battle map on the slopes of this sacred site? Will Grisus Goldtooth find his way into the game as a legendary lord? And will the Battle of the Firemouth feature as the campaign climax, for the player to forge their own version of the Ogre Kingdoms? Only time will tell, but CA, if you're listening, please consider including this battle in some manner into the campaign for the Ogre Kingdoms factions. Well, once more we come to the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Battle of the Fire Mouth, and will take the time to leave a like or comment, or perhaps even subscribe. This video was brought to you by the continued support of my patrons. Thanks to Hot Apple Pie, Cody Bonds, Alexander, and Solarith Magnetar. I'm Grey Tiger. Thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video.